Hello and welcome to the Taxcast from the Tax Justice Network. I'm Naomi Fowler. Coming up later.
Accounting was taught in a technical way. Relationships, culture, and even ethics and values do not really matter. It's all about being very good at tax avoidance and profit maximization. That's all that matters.
We talked to Professor Atul Shah on accountancy and ethics. Yes, they can go together. And as Britain sinks into full crisis mode over Brexit, we're here with an extended Taxcast this month to discuss some of the far-reaching consequences for the world. So we're going to go straight over to John Christensen now of the Tax Justice Network. Okay, John, so this month on the Taxcast we're going to have to talk about Brexit. Things are moving so fast now, who knows what's going to happen, but there's an increasing possibility of no-deal Brexit. It's a bit like watching a slow-motion car crash here in Britain. Tax Justice Network's by no means uncritical of the EU project. We've often criticised how very good EU policies have been watered down and more or less killed off, things like the transaction tax, financial transaction tax. But the European Union as a bloc does wield a lot of power, which it has used quite effectively in certain areas on fairer taxation. It's taken on the big multinationals on the very minimal taxes they're paying. And this kind of power will not be available to the UK when it goes solo, as we will see. And the current government's focus is all on a trade deal with the United States, one of the main things, arguably, that the whole Brexit project was all about. But what should we expect post-Brexit from the UK? How's it going to affect the world? We've got now another new Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who's lined up a particularly toxic new cabinet of leavers, all with strong links to the United States and all sorts of opaque think tanks, so-called, or lobbyists, as we prefer to call them, all funded by dark money. One of their really big things is Freeports, and they want to introduce up to 10 of them in the UK. They're pretty much condemned, quite belatedly, by the European Union as centres for money laundering and tax evasion, and as places that should be closed down. So why do they love them so much? What are these free ports? To whose benefit are they?
Okay, look, free ports, they're sometimes, by the way, called free zones. They are specially designated geographical spaces. They're created by national governments. They're spaces in which activity is either exempted entirely from taxes or tax rates are cut to minimal levels. Now, companies operating in free ports can move their products directly from ships or from aircraft into the free port facility without paying import tariffs. And they can store their products and their goods indefinitely without incurring taxes whilst they're held in the free port. And they can subsequently export the products without any tax payment. While many free ports are located inside the borders of a country, to all intents and purposes, we should see free ports as existing outside the national borders for tax purposes. In this respect, I think it would be correct to call free ports mini tax havens situated actually within national borders, physically onshore but legally offshore for tax purposes. You know, in many cases these concessions go beyond tax. Sometimes there is no union recognition, or national regulations on employment rights and health and safety protections are relaxed. In some cases, free ports apply strict secrecy rules to protect the identities of the people or companies using them, and this especially applies when free ports are used principally as a location for storing high-value items like works of art or gold bullion, or sometimes high-end motor cars and such like. And this secrecy space makes free ports prone to dirty money flows and to money laundering, which is what the European Union is concerned about, which is why in addition to having the tax haven label applied to free ports, it's also fair to call some free ports secrecy jurisdictions as well. The free port idea is not exactly a new one. They've been around for centuries in Asia and Africa and in Europe. And within the European Union there are currently 82 free ports spread across 21 member states, including long-established free ports in Copenhagen and Bremen in Germany. The tax-free status allows companies to make full use of existing port infrastructures, trained workforces, security and justice services, and loads of other public services without having to contribute to them by paying taxes. In economics, this is the well-known free rider syndrome, which is always totally ignored by the free market think tanks and the many academic economists who promote the Freeport idea. And then there's the dirty money aspects, which mean that many free ports have become repositories for huge volumes of wealth, unknown billions, maybe even trillions, which can be used for money laundering and tax dodging.
So research on this and evidence depends who you talk to, right? So one consultancy firm thinks that creating 7 free ports in the north of England could add £9 billion a year to Britain's GDP and create 150,000 jobs. Isn't that fantastic? And then others have looked at the impact economically of free ports elsewhere in other countries, and they've suggested that, for example, the experience in the United States is not very promising, and there's very little evidence of how much money is kind of a net creation and how much of it is just redistributing economic activity from elsewhere in the country.
Yeah, look, first of all, I think that many of the consulting reports are to be taken with a very, very large pinch of salt, because so many of these consultants, of course, are commissioned by the people who actually want these free port facilities, but it serves their personal purposes. I think the consulting reports are largely an exercise in hokum and public relations. Free ports have a really long history in Asia, Europe and elsewhere, and the experiences are, to be very polite, decidedly mixed, let's put it that way, and, as you say, in the United States. The more recent experience, in other words, the experience, let's say in the last 70 years or so, and in particular, if we look at the Irish Shannon Airport Freeport, which was set up in the 1950s, the evidence suggests that in Europe, free ports have had very, very localized benefits in terms of perhaps some low-grade employment creation. Certainly the Shannon Freeport attracted very large American companies wanting to get access to the European markets, but mostly it displaced economic activity from one place to another, in other words, from where taxes and labour protections apply to Shannon, the Freeport, where tax exemptions apply and labour rights are reduced. In the UK, for example, Mrs Thatcher's government created free ports at Prestwick in Scotland, in Liverpool, in Southampton, in Belfast, Cardiff, Birmingham, and they continued operating right the way through to 2012, when their free port licences were withdrawn. And again, the evidence here suggests that they achieved very little in the way of economic development and were largely a negative rather than a positive, because they displaced activity from other areas, very often leading to lower wage rates within the free port, and they allowed big companies to avoid taxes whilst free-riding on state-funded services. Now, we don't have details of the Freeport proposals of the new Johnson government in Britain, but they appear to form part of a much wider development strategy, which is known as the Singapore on the Thames model, which will involve turning the UK into a world-leading tax haven and secrecy jurisdiction located right alongside the European Union. The Freeport idea needs very much more careful evaluation before the Johnson government goes ahead. And if the proposals are truly as wild as some of the free trade advocates are demanding, then maybe they will need to be contested under European law, mainly because they're anti-competitive, they're anti-market, and maybe they even need to be referred to the World Trade Organization.
Right, well, you heard it first here on the Taxcast. And the other thing is that Britain's ports are privately owned, unlike European ports, although I remember one of the controversial things up for grabs when Greece was being bailed out was its ports and privatising those. I'm quoting from a chief executive of the UK Major Ports Group writing about Brexit on a Conservative website. He said, quote, "The UK can set regulation that is right for our competitive private sector-led national context rather than being lumbered with rules written for the statist monopolies elsewhere in Europe."
I mean, we just have to listen to that language to recognise that we're dealing with ideological maniacs who are largely economically illiterate, but also there's something else at play. Of course he'd say all of that because this person will benefit from, the lower taxes, from the higher profits, from the higher bonuses he'll be achieving. This is not a person who can be seen as an entirely objective judge on whether a free port idea is good or not.
Right. Let's talk about the National Health Service and the effect of Brexit on that. Almost all the political and media focus has been on the short-term chaos of Brexit, whether it's deal or no deal. But actually Brexit has some toxic long-term consequences, and one of them is what will happen to the National Health Service. how that also will affect public health service models, state health service models around the world. Situation where you can't afford to access healthcare is all too familiar to many US citizens, but it's not something that British people have really experienced until recent years, since we've had here cradle-to-grave healthcare with no charges at the point of delivery because of taxation, and we've had the most efficient and low-cost system that the world has ever known because of that. But there has been slow elements of privatisation and outsourcing of public health to private providers. Fees are being introduced, which didn't exist before. Lots of politicians are funded by private healthcare companies, which have been ringing alarm bells for a long time with campaigners. And now we have Brexit, which provides opportunities which Mrs. Thatcher, the privatisation pioneer, might only have dreamed of. So let's talk about what exactly the threat is now to the National Health Service. It's really a huge cash cow which the private sector has been eyeing up for years. And I think the thing to focus on, if I understand rightly, is that the National Health Service is the biggest state buyer of medicines in the world. And that has a huge effect on what Brexit actually means.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The starting point, Britain's National Health Service is definitely one of the largest employers in the world. It's also one of the largest purchasers of pharmaceutical products in the world. And that makes it a very powerful economic actor on the global stage. Powerful US lobbies, bearing in mind that many of the most predatory private health sector companies are US insurance businesses or health service providers, and of course pharmaceutical companies. They are pushing very, very hard to have access to the UK market and to break up the National Health Service. And this is almost certainly going to be one of the key issues around which trade negotiations between Johnson's government in Britain and Trump's government in the United States are going to be kind of focusing the attention. Now, getting back to the NHS, so enormous is its purchasing power that it is one of the few, possibly even the only health service in the world that can push back against the power of the big privately owned pharmaceutical monopolies, the corporate giants, which are largely known as the big pharma. So the NHS is actually in a position, as such a powerful buyer, to set guide prices for drugs and medical kit. And that those guide prices serve as indicators for health services across the world, and they do refer to NHS purchase prices in their negotiations with the big pharmaceutical companies. So you can see how crucially important the NHS is, not only in Britain in keeping drugs and medical kit supplies to a reasonable price, but also it's a powerful agent, I'd argue, working to protect citizens from across the world. Now, you can understand in that situation why big pharma companies, particularly the big US companies, want to erode the purchasing power of the NHS, and they are spending small fortunes on political lobbying in Britain to push for what they call modernisation of the health services. It has been a political buzzword since the 1990s. It became a very important part of the kind of third way of thinking. And in most cases, it relates to privatisation of state-provided services and further erosion of or complete reduction of the ability of states to resist the growth of privately owned monopoly providers. And Big Pharma, I think, in some respects, is one of the worst examples of very predatory pricing and predatory strategies for marketing direct to citizens at way, way above anything that can be regarded as a reasonable market price.
Right, and as we have seen with so many things, there is nothing that can't be financialised. And when you look at some of the richest people in the world, so many billionaires have made their money from privatisation, actually, of public assets or public services. And so they have a good reason to financially support pushes towards privatisation, but that's obviously not in the interests of citizens. What does all this say about these kind of late stages of capitalism and financialisation that we're living in now?
As it happens, I think the pharmaceutical industry is a really interesting example of how capitalism has changed as a result of the Thatcher and Reagan revolutions in the early 1980s. Now, look, most people think of drugs and medical equipment as part of a wider health service that should be benefiting humankind as a whole. Now, through the 1950s, the 1960s and the 70s, huge publicly funded research and development programs made massive progress towards tackling terrible diseases. Think, for example, of polio or smallpox, many cancers and others, all of which have become treatable, in some cases eradicated. Life expectancies have increased across most countries in the world as a direct result of this progress. And if you stand back a bit and look at it, the World Health Organization was a key player, for example, in programs against polio and smallpox. They played a key role in tackling killer diseases. And Britain's NHS was also a very key player in this respect. Now, more recently, and I think this is directly as a result of the Thatcher and Reagan revolutions and the privatisation of so many aspects of medical and health care services, big money has moved into the field. The pharmaceutical companies have concentrated into global monopolies like GlaxoSmithKline, Johnson & Johnson, Reckitt-Bexiga. They hold many long-standing patent monopolies on a very wide variety of crucial drugs and medical products. And these companies, it has to be said, are backed by really powerful political lobby organizations. For example, in the United States, you have the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, which is a trade group and a very powerful lobby on the Hill in Washington. And if you look at Britain and London, you see the Institute for Economic Affairs, which has recently been appointed as a key advisor to the Johnson government. The Institute for Economic Affairs refuses to reveal its funding sources, but we know that tobacco and oil and pharma companies fund it, clearly lobbies on behalf of big US corporate interests. So you can see how these things all tie together. And now we have the US corporate lobbies right there at the heart of the Johnson government. But there's another fact, which is that in this era of late capitalism that you're talking about, the pharmaceutical market globally is morphing into an even more predatory, privately owned, monopolist-dominated market. We have new companies like, these are names which most people probably aren't familiar with, Valiant, Turing Pharmaceuticals, Sodalis, many others. And they've moved into the health market. Their business model is entirely driven by buying patent rights to particular drugs, hiking up the prices of those drugs to astonishing levels. And all this is being done in the name of the shareholder value revolution, which has transformed capitalism since the Reagan-Thatcher era. Valiant, for example, bought up the rights to a drug called Glumetza, which is used in tackling diabetes. They immediately hiked the end-user price, which is the price that the patient has to pay for Glumetza, from $800 for a 90-day supply to a whopping $10,000 for exactly the same supply. Now, in economic terms, that's pure monopolistic rent-seeking. In social terms, it's a disaster for people who suffer from diabetes. And the investors behind this scheme, they have absolutely no interest in promoting better healthcare. They have simply used their financial muscle to exploit a private monopoly. You can see why the health system in the United States is amongst the most expensive in per capita terms in the world, and at the same time is the only place among all the advanced economies where life expectancies in the United States for poorer people are currently falling, and falling very fast indeed. This is a colossal failure. So we're dealing with a systemic failure of capitalism, and Britain's NHS is one of the very few institutions in the world which has sufficient economic power to resist these predatory monopolies. My fear is that if the NHS loses its power in this area, we can reasonably expect that drug prices will increase in many, if not most, countries around the world, and life expectancies and qualities of life will worsen as a result.
That's really grim to listen to.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It is really grim, but I think that's the inevitable outcome of where the right-wing free marketeers have now packed out Johnson's government will take us.
Right, so what can we do about it then? I mean, perhaps you need to have certain rights written into constitutions, national constitutions, I don't know, with the protection of the National Health Service written into it, protection against the financing of politics by private interests, things like that. But what are the realistic possibilities that we have available to us to combat this?
Well, lots can be done. Certainly I agree with what you've already proposed. And many things can be done to resist this pressure from Big Pharma. First of all, I think in Britain we should be giving top priority to protecting the NHS's role as drug purchaser and therefore as a barrier to predatory drug monopolies. That should be number one priority. But I think we also need to address the issue of how these monopolies arise, because many pharmaceutical companies hold patents which are essentially very long-term monopolies on drugs. And now I think it's time to call into question the way in which patents are allowed to stretch for decades and after decade after decade. I think it'd be far better to have shorter patent terms and open the drug market up to proper competition. It would force the prices down. They would come tumbling to much lower levels. I also think that many of the pharma monopolies are simply far too big and should be taken under state control. That's right, I said it, they need to be nationalised. Health is far too important to human welfare to be left to very greedy and inefficient private sector monopolies. And another thing, as we all know, big pharma, they are very aggressive tax avoiders. So, as we've argued for a long time, new global rules are needed to tackle this tax avoidance, and that is why Tax Justice Network has been pushing for a shift towards unitary taxation with apportionment of taxing rights to the countries where the economic activity actually takes place. Now that, in the case of pharma, that would mean the enormous global profits, these monopolist profits which they're accumulating and very often booking into tax havens, would be apportioned for tax purposes to the countries where the sales actually take place. In other words, where the end users, the patients, are actually using these drugs. And we could completely ignore the sham schemes which park these patent rights into places like Cayman and Bermuda. And that, I think, would do a great deal to recoup some of the astonishing profits the big pharma companies are making. But the real issue is that politicians need to recognise that their primary duty here is to protect the interests of citizens who need healthcare, and not to spend all their time protecting the interests of investors who are literally making a killing from overpriced drugs products.
Thanks, John. John Christensen of the Tax Justice Network. Now it's time for the Taxcast special feature. We've been saying for years on the Taxcast that no matter what the latest scandal is, there's a whole industry of professional enablers who always manage to slink into the shadows. That's because the media tends to obsess about celebrities caught in the tax dodging spotlight. The big accountancy firms are among those who are key to financial secrecy, tax haven use, and our plummeting corporate tax revenues. They're the ones that are hurting ordinary people, they're undermining democracies, and they're fueling political instability. We really can't afford to allow them to continue to facilitate the looting of nation states as they are, and to capture government policy in the way they have. But it doesn't have to be that way. There are many accountants who practice their profession with a strong ethical base. Today I have with me Professor Atul Shah of City University in London. His own foundational principles come from Jainism, an ancient Indian religion which has non-violence and integrity at its heart. He's written books on Jainism and ethical finance, about the largest corporate failure ever in British history, the HBOS collapse, and on reinventing accounting and finance education. Let's talk about your experience training as an accountant first of all, because I think there was some clashes very early on between your own philosophy and what was being taught or not being taught in your accountancy training. Let's start there.
Yeah, so I was born in Kenya in 1961, and I came at the age of 18 to the London School of Economics to study accounting and finance. The accounting profession has always been a very popular profession in our culture and community, in the Jain community. And so it was a natural thing to do. And I did very well in my studies at the LSE. I got a first class, and then at that time we had big 8 firms, and I got 5 job offers in the big 8 firms, and I had to choose.
Now it's the big 4.
Yeah, and now it's the big 4. And I had to choose. So I went for KPMG, and I started working there in 1983 and training at the same time to become a chartered accountant. I did find culturally very difficult because I guess I was culturally very different. And at that time, there was very little awareness about diverse cultures and about integration of diverse cultures. And of course, even as a student at the LSE, there was very little mention of culture in any of the lectures I attended. So accounting was taught in a technical way, almost in an acultural way. So even ethics was hardly mentioned at that time when I was studying. But the reality of accounting practice, very often as I travel around the world, especially for small and medium-sized businesses, it's very much a cultural practice. It's very much about relationships, about trust, and then the technical qualifications and experience come. But so much of it is about a trust. I mean, if you think at a very simple level, if an accountant is managing a client's business and the books, then the accountant comes to know everything that the client does, all the money that the client is making. If the accountant wants to betray the client, they could do that quite easily. So trust is central to becoming a good accountant. But of course, in the modern business school, which started from America, it's very difficult to teach trust. So instead we teach formula. The formula of getting rich quick. The formula of doing proper accounting, whatever that means. And indirectly we are saying that by teaching the formula, we are indirectly conveying the impression that relationships, culture, and even ethics and values do not really matter. It's all about being technically competent and being very good at tax avoidance and profit maximization. That's all that matters.
Yeah, all that matters, but not what matters to you. And it's interesting that you've gone on to teach people who will become accountants and will work in all sorts of levels in accountancy. I mean, you've had your own experience. Is that still going on now with this lack of emphasis on ethics?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, ethics is being taught now, but not all over the world, but it is being taught because of all these scandals. But the way ethics is taught is also technical and transactional. So, for example, learn the code of ethics, learn that honesty is important, learn that integrity is important. But what do they actually mean, in practical everyday life? And so they are taught principles of ethics and effectively how to answer exam questions based on those principles of ethics. But you and I know that in everyday life, ethics is about our own beliefs, our own faith or no faith, and it's about our own upbringing, about our own relationships with our neighbors, with our relatives, and to forget about all that personal cultural experience and history in ethical dialogue and ethical teaching is completely wrong, in my opinion. And it almost gives the impression to the student that their own culture and values do not matter. All that matters is to learn this new code of ethics and then to apply it. And this code of ethics existed in HBOS Bank, which is the largest corporate failure in British history. So it was just a template which nobody observed, right? And it is in Deutsche Bank, it is in every big organization. Goldman Sachs would have a code of ethics, but then you have very big scandals going on. So actually, this method of ethical education is wrong. And what I believe is that it has to start from the student as a human being and their own culture and their own values, and then encouraging and enabling them to reflect on what that culture and values mean in terms of how they practice finance, how they build trust and relationships, and what they want out of life. I tell my students, if you want to get rich quick and then retire on the beach at 30, you may just succeed by being unethical and make that money. But do you really want to retire on a beach at 30? Or rather, do you want to do something which keeps you happy, keeps you occupied, gives you a steady standard of living, and keeps your business flowing? Because your clients act as your ambassadors. And I've come across so many stories of that. To give an example, my friend Bharat Danani has a practice here in London, in central London. One day a client came to him and said, "Can I have a whole box of your business cards?" My friend said, "Why do you want a box of my business card?" He says, "I want to go back to my community and tell everyone you're the best accountant in the world." Now, how did that happen? My friend did not ask him to do any publicity for him, but it was because of the relationship he had cultivated, the trust he had nurtured, that the client felt that I want to go out and actually tell others about what this person has done for me and my business. So this only can come when you set your own standards. You create your own discipline about what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do. And when I share these stories with students, I also invite them to bring their own stories to the table, their own experiences with finance. And once they do that, they begin to see how ethics and relationships matter and how they would like to be treated, and therefore how they could treat others. And they feel proud of that, and they feel they can connect to it, they can bring their own faith into the classroom discussion if they have one, and then the whole subject comes alive.
There's another philosophy, isn't there, based on the idea about business itself as you've got to go get them and you've got to take out the competition, and it's quite aggressive. And in fact, that's probably a relatively recent philosophy about business and finance. It hasn't always been that way, has it? It's it's been a lot more about interconnectedness, interdependence, collaboration as the secrets behind the most successful ways of approaching business and finance.
No, absolutely. And in a way, I would say that my own academy is responsible for that. Economists came up with this idea about profit maximization, and that means cost minimization. And the work of the Tax Justice Network is showing what has happened to cost minimization. So in a way, I think alongside ethics teaching, we also must teach students why the public sector is important, why it is important to pay taxes, how public infrastructure helps business to succeed and to grow and to expand. We know the internet was invented by the US military, right? And now we are all reaping the benefits from it, but it was a public sector initiative. So when we look at it from those points of view, at the moment in business schools, there's hardly any teaching about the public sector. There is hardly any teaching about taxation and its importance in providing all the kind of public services at the cheapest cost, like National Health Service. So we need to integrate some of that into our teaching, to really embed ethical considerations into professional accounting and finance. And actually, when we do that, and when I have done that, students begin to understand, they do appreciate, and they do realize that, hang on a minute, I was born in an NHS hospital. I benefited from that. This university is publicly funded. That's how I'm getting my education and training. My schools were publicly funded. That's how I got my education. Therefore, I should pay taxes, and also companies should pay their taxes. So once we teach it in that way, they can see that. But also when we bring matters of social capital into the equation, and not social capital as a formula, but social capital as in the uncles and the neighbors and the relatives who have helped them to come where they are today, or the mentors who have advised them to go to university or pursue a particular course. When they again understand that, that's when they see that actually, life and success in life comes from mutual support and encouragement rather than from selfishness, short-sightedness and greed.
I would assume that if you've got that ability to reflect on those things, would have a pretty hard time in, for example, the higher echelons of finance, say in the big four accountancy firms or something. It must be a really painful place to be. I mean, maybe some of the training people undergo is designed in the way it is to ensure that people can live their lives without feeling that connection.
Yes, it is. And as a result, many of young people who have a high ethical standards are actually not going into big commerce or big four professions or even into banking, but they're setting up their own social enterprises or their own businesses with very strong values about development in the third world, creating new technologies which could empower ordinary people. And I think those stories don't come out much, but they definitely are there, and there are more of them are coming up because a lot of young people are concerned about their own future. You're seeing the whole climate change movement being spiraled by a 13-year-old teenager, right? It's their future. And I think as university academics, like myself, I try to give space to these young people to articulate the kind of future they want to build. And then they begin to also see that actually ethical finance is needed, and actually this is the time for practicing ethical finance, and that it can work. It's not as if nobody will want to talk to you if you practice ethically. On the contrary, if you are willing to help people and advise them on finance, then you will never be unemployed at all. In my book, Jainism and Ethical Finance, I talk about the Jain community, which is my own community. It is one of the oldest living cultures of the world, but it also happens to be one of the world's most successful and enduring cultures of finance. So in the book, I try to explain with my co-author Aidan Rankin the ways in which the Jains practice finance and accounting and what it is that has given them multi-generational sustained success in finance. And at the root of it is their own ethics and their own belief in the interdependence of all life. I know so many Jain businesses where they do zero marketing. They don't need to do any marketing. The business just comes. And in fact, sometimes they often have to turn it down because they cannot cope. I mean, that's the other thing that I'm theorizing, that actually, just as people are talking about veganism and organic food, there is also an organic theory of finance, a raw theory of finance, which can be very much built around people, around relationships, around trust, and making sure that whatever we do through finance, we build better relationships, more relationships, and increase levels of trust and respect for nature and society. And that organic theory for finance is written about in our book. It's also written about in my book on reinventing accounting and finance education. And that whole combination can chart a future for a planet which is more caring and a profession which is inclusive and sustainable.
There's a lot of resistance to that, though, isn't there? I hear that a lot of, particularly in economics, educational establishments, that there's a lot of pushback against the idea that they might be teaching more than classical economics, and that there's a lot more to the story, and that things have moved on so far since the 1970s.
Correct.
And that's actually surprisingly controversial.
Yeah, I mean, research shows that inside business schools there are big fights among faculty about the teaching of business ethics. Because when business ethics is taught, students start asking difficult questions to their professors, to their marketing professors, to their economics and finance professors, to their management professors, etc. Some of these professors don't even know where to begin on ethical conversation or ethical dialogue. They only think there's only one way to live, which is to be greedy and selfish and materialistic. So as a result, in many business schools, business ethics is not taught or is banned from the business school. Or where it is taught, the professors who teach business ethics are marginalized. They are being talked about as if they are fluffy and woolly creatures, right? However, I still think that we should not close our eyes to the huge transformation that is going on in society. There is a new dawn which is happening, like the 13-year-old marching against climate change. There is a new dawn emerging, and we need to prepare ourselves for the new dawn. The resistance is coming from the old guard, from the traditionals. And business schools, if they don't change, if they don't innovate, they will find their market drop like anything. And then where will they go searching for students and professors? So there is a tremendous change going on, and we need to tune in to that change and to the demands from young people for an ethical finance.
Yeah, I'm always saying there's definitely a generational shift in power going on, and we're witnessing it, particularly this year now has particularly taken off. But what do you think, having looked for such a long time now on the way that the accountancy profession works and how people operate in finance, other than education, making the changes that we all agree need to be made in the way that people are trained and educated, what would be the most impactful thing that could happen to the accountancy profession to deal with this lack of a moral dimension or awareness of ethics?
I think prison should be very real for accounting professionals who advise on aggressive tax avoidance schemes, without a doubt. Because at the moment, there is virtually no personal punishment or reprimand, and we need to get very tough on these matters. And so prison for individuals, and then, of course, the breakup of the big four is very urgently needed. They are too big, too powerful, and they are spreading their cancer wherever they go. So that is urgently needed. They should not be allowed to do both audit and consultancy. They should also not be providing tax avoidance services and taking government contracts at the same time. They should really be forced to act as independent professionals. We have lost a lot about what it means to be human, and what it means to feel, and what it means to have a sense of purpose in life. And I think we need to go back to those roots.
You've been listening to the Taxcast from the Tax Justice Network. You can find out more about Professor Shah's books on www.city.ac.uk/people/academics/Atul-Shah. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next month.